Madison Cox at the Beatrice Inn last fall at a dinner for the interior decorator Francois Catroux, whose wife is Betty Catroux, a muse of Yves Saint Laurent. As two museums devoted to the designer Yves Saint Laurent open this month, in Paris and Marrakesh, there has been plenty of chatter in fashion and café society what's left of it about the estate of Pierre Bergé, the pugnacious business brain behind the original Yves Saint Laurent fashion empire. Mr. Bergé died of myopathy at 86 last month. In March, he had married Madison Cox, a 59-year-old American garden designer, in a private civil ceremony near Deauville, France, making Mr. Cox his presumptive legal heir. Whatever the fiscal strategy behind this union, Mr. Bergé seemed determined to make one last symbolic point about their relationship, which lasted more than 35 years and had involved an operatic emotional triangle with Mr. Saint Laurent, who died in 2008. As weddings go, it was unusual in at least one respect. Mr. Cox has another partner of 11 years, Jaimal Odedra, a Bollywood costume designer and creator of home accessories. In a phone interview en route to her home in Hughsonville, NY, Alison Spear, an architect who employed Mr. Cox, a dear friend for 25 years, was asked what made Mr. Cox and Mr. Odedra tick as a couple. "They are both highly talented and accomplished gentlemen," Ms. Spear said. "They complement each other." Mr. Cox, the estate's executor, declined to be interviewed for this article. But many have been unable to resist making a quick mental inventory of Mr. Bergé's holdings: the paintings, the furniture, the libraries, and the cash. An auction of his and Mr. Saint Laurent's personal collection fetched hundreds of millions in 2009. The interest Mr. Bergé held in the French daily Le Monde has already been divested. The Pierre Bergé Yves Saint Laurent Foundation operates, among other properties, the public Majorelle garden containing the Islamic Art Museum. Abdelix and Augance, France Press, Getty Images. Those who pictured Mr. Cox shuttling luxuriously among the homes Mr. Bergé kept in Paris, Normandy, Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, Marrakech and Tangier will be disappointed, according to Quito Fierro, the chief administrative officer of the Jardin Majorelle Foundation. The foundation is a subsidiary of the Pierre Bergé Yves Saint Laurent Foundation that operates, along with a museum in Marrakech, the public Majorelle garden and a museum of Berber culture there. The vacation house Mr. Bergé built in Normandy was not his. Mr. Fierro said he simply retained the right to use the house after selling it in Château Gabriel, on the same grounds, following Mr. Saint Laurent's death. And the other residences, including Villa Mabrouka and Tangier, which has been on and off the market in recent years with an asking price of around $10 million, will be sold to benefit the Umbrella Foundation, whose presidency has passed from Mr. Bergé to Mr. Cox, Mr. Fierro said. No one should be worried about Mr. Cox's housing, however. Villa Oasis, the lavish Orientalist fantasy where Mr. Bergé lived in Marrakesh, is part of the Majorelle Foundation, but is Mr. Cox's in all but name, a perk that comes with the guardianship of Mr. Saint Laurent's artistic legacy. For all the clucking and tallying, Mr. Cox and Mr. Bergé's wedding was met with little more than a nod by those who track the movements of the forbidding and glamorous, if increasingly diminished, clan that surrounded Mr. Saint Laurent. Mr. Bergé in 1988, soon after he was appointed president of Opera Bastille. Jean-Luc Godreau against France Press, Getty Images. Christopher Gibbs, a neighbor in Tangier, where Mr. Cox has a residence of his own, called him a saintly figure, which could not be said of Pierre. Mr. Gibbs, a retired dealer in high bohemian antiques who dressed the sets for the Mick Jagger film performance, praised Mr. Cox for being such a wonderful support to Pierre, through thick and thin, and for so many years. "I weep for Madison having all this responsibility. It's beyond the call of duty." Jane Kramer, in her takedown of Mr. Bergé in The New Yorker in 1994, put Mr. Bergé's unsaintliness another way, writing, "He has a lugubrious, rather terrifying self-regard. He appears undisturbed by the tempering plain truths of self-reflection," she wrote, noting that his wrath was legendary. Mr. Bergé had more than one l'amour fou, crazy love, the name he gave the 2010 documentary about him and Mr. Saint Laurent. In published letters he wrote to Mr. Saint Laurent after the designer died, he made Mr. Cox's place in the hierarchy of his heart clear. "With you, Madison remains the most important relationship of my life. He arrived when alcohol and drugs had taken possession of you. Thanks to Madison, probably, I weathered the storm," Mr. Bergé continued. "He gave me what I needed: his youth, culture, courage, integrity, love." Mr. Saint Laurent after one of his fashion shows in 1983, several years after he and Mr. Bergé became involved with Mr. Cox. Pierre Gillaud against France Press, Getty Images. "I didn't leave you," Mr. Bergé went on to write. "I could have during this time with Madison, I almost did. Finally, it was he who'd had enough, who left. You loved him, hated him, then loved him again. Maria Callas could not have sung the strangulated story of Mr. Bergé, Mr. Saint Laurent and Mr. Cox any better. In 1976, nearly 2 decades after meeting, Mr. Bergé broke romantically from Mr. Saint Laurent. Still, jealousy and possessiveness ran high, and the men remained business partners. Accounts of the Cox-Bergé introduction vary. Mr. Cox has placed it in Paris in 1978. Annabelle Duarte, a jewelry designer and member of the old Saint Laurent tribe, puts their first meeting in New York a year earlier, when Mr. Cox was a student at Parsons. At the time, Mr. Bergé was involved with Joel LeBon, who was in charge of the music for the Saint Laurent shows and worked for Interview magazine in Paris. I introduced Joel to Madison. They fell in love, and Madison followed Joel to Paris, transferring to Parsons there, Ms. Duarte said. Mr. Bergé got to know Mr. Cox better during a trip they took with her and Mr. LeBon to the Aeolian Islands the following summer. According to Mattia Bonetti, a furniture designer who knew Mr. Cox in Paris in the 1980s, Madison was first with Joel, then Yves, then finally Pierre. After the holiday in the Aeolians, Madison ascended quickly in the Saint Laurent clan, Ms. Duarte said. Joel no longer measured up and was dropped. The clan was like a tank that rolled over you, then moved on, laughing loudly and shrugging. Who cares? Joel died of AIDS, forgotten. Mr. Bonetti said that, in the beginning, Mr. Cox and Mr. Bergé saw each other, not in a hidden way, but separate from Yves to avoid scenes. Over dinner one night when Mr. Cox had stepped away from the table, Mr. Bonetti said Mr. Bergé asked him, "What do I have to do to keep him?" I told him, "You have to give Madison everything, and I don't mean materially, because otherwise he's going to leave." Mr. Bergé felt obliged to engage someone else for the garden at Gabriel, because of the tension that using Mr. Cox would have created with Mr. Saint Laurent. The job fell to a Louis Benick, who would later turn his hand to the Tuileries, the new Yves Saint Laurent Museum in Paris. Dmitry Kostakov for the New York Times. I said to Pierre that I didn't see the point of my working at Gabriel when he could hire his friend, Mr. Benick recalled. Too complicated, he said. Peter Dunham, a decorator in Los Angeles, met Mr. Cox in Paris during his early years with Mr. Bergé. Pierre really didn't allow Madison to have friends, Mr. Dunham said. He lived a very controlled, gilded cage existence. Jane Stubbs, an antiquarian bookseller, was commissioned by Mr. Bergé to create a Morocco-themed library for a guest room at Mabrouka. She remembered arriving in Tangier with Madison and waiting at the luggage carousel. His phone rang. It was Pierre. "Where have you been? You were supposed to get in at 525. It was 527. The triangle collapsed during Christmas 1987, when, as Mr. Bergé wrote, Mr. Saint Laurent began hiding tumblers of whiskey from him behind the Jacques Grange taffeta curtains at Gabriel. Mr. Cox retreated to New York, opening an office and remaking his life with Constantine Cacanias, an illustrator and artist. Mr. Bergé took up with Robert Merlauz, a young designer he backed with company money. Mr. Merlauz's collection flopped. Christopher Mason, a musician and social chronicler, said that when Mr. Cox left him, Pierre was flabbergasted. He couldn't believe anyone would dare walk out on him. Mr. Cox also enjoyed, and was sometimes inconvenienced by, what might be called amitiés amoureuses pararomantic friendships, with Ms. Stubbs and Marion McAvoy, the author of Glue Gun Decor: How to Dress Up Your Home, From Pillows and Curtains to Sofas and Lampshades. Mr. Cox, with a BFA in environmental design and an address book fortified by Mr. Bergé's, has never lacked business. His clients include Michael Bloomberg, Mirella Agnelli, Lauren Santo Domingo and Ann Bass, who let him loose on 1,000 acres in Litchfield County, Con. At one point Nancy Novograd, a former magazine editor, expressed interest in hiring Mr. Cox in Litchfield. But the message came back that he had given Ms. Bass an exclusive. Correction: October 7, 2017. Because of an editing error, an earlier version of this article suggested in one instance that Jaimal Odedra and Pierre Bergé were a couple. Mr. Odedra is the partner of Madison Cox. The earlier version also misstated Constantine Cacanias' profession. While he has created some cartoons, he is primarily an illustrator and visual artist. A version of this article appears in print on October 8, 2017, on page ST11 of the New York edition with the headline Pierre and even Madison Cox. It's complicated.